Good morning, everyone, on this rainy Sunday morning in Zurich. Thank you for coming out. We are Waves. We run a program called Waves. It's a sort of idealized concept rather than a program necessarily. It was born during the pandemic, which I guess was this time of great questioning for us all. Everyone sitting on their own in a room, wondering why they do what they do. And so Waves is really this idea to form a new kind of community, and one that's constantly shifting and renewing. And so this idea of the metaphor of the wave, where the initial movement then sets off a series of chain reactions within a community. So we were trying to find ways to bring our community of artists and curators and cultural workers together in Zurich. So it's also a local project. You know, we believe in our local community. Yeah, so as I say, it was really sort of wanting to find ways of sharing ideas and talking about the things that were in our heads, but also sharing resources and general obsessions that artists tend to have. So we ran the studio program we have run it for 3 years. We have a selection of artists each year, and then we, as a group, go and spend a whole day in their studio, and we talk about what's happening in there and what's not happening in there. And we think about the studio as a space that doesn't always have new people in to reflect on what's going on there. So it's also, Waves is also, it's important to us that it's a generous idea, like we're there to be optimistic and generous about the struggles that are happening in the studio. So this was this format, and we decided we also wanted to have a more public-facing format, and actually sort of to rethink certain formats that we as artists are sometimes obliged into. And so we wanted to rethink the artist talk, because actually I'm not always convinced that artists are the best people to talk about their own work. Like, your own work is this immense, complicated, monstrous thing for you. And narrating it can come with its own problems. So we had this idea to have artists talk about the work of another artist. So hence, Künstler on Artists was born, and we've been doing it since the beginning of last year. It's been supported by Kunsthalle Zurich. It's been happening in their basement. This is very different to the basement vibe, but the concept remains entirely the same. So each time we invite an artist to come and talk about the work of another artist whose work is important to their own practice. As I say, it's really an antidote to the artist talk where you're only thinking about yourself. This format is designed to illuminate both practices, both the one talked about as well as the one talking. And I think we feel in that sense you get a new dimension on both the speaker and the spoken of. And we've tried to sort of have rules, but the only rule that really is important is it has to be a living artist, because that makes it a lot more challenging. Right.
Yeah, okay, so just some more things about what's happened during these talks. It's a very simple format, but it yields kind of to infinite variety, because people just decide who to talk about and how to talk about whom. So this is what we too will do here today, as well as to kind of exercise on ourselves as well. So during the talks, we've heard about art from all corners of the world, all kinds of different practices. People have dared to speak about both kind of recognized but also unrecognized practitioners. We have people talk about friends or their mentors, kind of their artist, kind of ideals or heroes, heroines, whatever. Or also people they just found at chance. We had a talk, for example, about a clairvoyant painter whose work one artist discovered in a Brockenhaus, like in a thrift store. We also had talks about Bruce Nauman or Taus Makacheva, like more kind of known positions. Also a talk about a hilarious encounter with the Mona Hatoum sculpture that got damaged. A talk about the graphic designer who conceived the birth of the inspirational posters that are hanging in like offices worldwide, you know, the courage, inspire, thrive. So somebody gave a talk on this person, and every person seems to have a completely different take on the task we kind of present them with. So the talks generally reject the traditional notion of kind of taste and cultural value or art historical kind of accuracy. So these are not talks that are kind of aiming at an art historic representation, but really come from artists kind of in homage or in wrangling with another artist. They're given by people with genuine obsessions or who are genuine obsessives and who spend every day thinking about what moves them and how to move others with what they make. So this is a little bit about waves, and I just wanted to add that no, I didn't want to add anything. We're an artist-initiated initiative. I think that's maybe important to say. So Leila will present her talk first on Tacita Din, and then I will present a talk on Helen Mirra. Thank you for coming.
This is the only shot I'm going to show that has anything to do with my own work. This is a shot of my studio that I took yesterday. And I taken it because of this piece of, it's actually a piece of stained glass that's been stenciled. So I was trying to sandblast text onto it. And it's this phrase, "We are all haunted houses." And I think for me, this really is a sort of theme of this particular presentation. So as Izidora said, I'm going to talk about Tacita Din, who's well known. This is not a sort of underground gesture. And she's certainly not my friend, though I maybe wish she was. But she is someone whose work has haunted my house, so to speak. I feel that as artists, we are in the business of moving people. As we think about this a lot, how to evoke thought and even wonder. I often use the metaphor of alchemy, so how to turn lead into gold seems like a good metaphor for the experience of this process. Or as Louis Kamnitzer, who's also someone I hugely admire, once wrote, how to put the genie in the lamp. For this, we look at other people's work constantly, but we also observe ourselves being moved, as Izidora said. So my talk, I chose Tacita Din because this is a challenging one for me because I love it, but I've never tried to really understand why. There's a way in which sometimes it's like nailing custard to the wall. You're never going to actually arrive at a why, but I think sometimes it's interesting to try and fail. So this is my attempt. I really wanted to try and get an anatomy of the feeling that we are all in search of when we encounter art. And because I feel that especially those of us who are in this world see so many things, and we're always searching for a particular way in which we know we can be moved by art, and it happens increasingly less for me. So when it does happen, I find it actually very interesting. So this is from my studio, and this is her studio. It was quite hard to find pictures of her in the studio. She seems to have lots of studios, but this is one because I know that she's well known as a filmmaker, but I'm really going to talk about her drawing because I have a drawing practice, and so it's her drawing that is really interesting for me to try and understand. But here she is, and you can see some of her blackboards mounted on the wall, and she's also someone who it's interesting for us to talk about with Waves because she's someone who has sought to portray the artist studio in her work. So I think the films I would mention are the films where she's gone in and filmed artists in their studios. And so probably one of the most famous ones is Cy Twombly in his studio in Beaumont, I think. Again, yeah, details. And so she does these portraits, and I think what's nice is that the New Yorker described these portraits as a testament to the ineffable process by which obsession, solitude, boredom, and repetition are transfigured in the studio. The studio is a strange place because it's a place within your head as much as it is a physical space. And what happens in there is quite hard to categorize. And I think if you filmed a lot of artists in their studio, they wouldn't really seem to be doing much at all. Certainly, she said that Twombly in his studio was mostly just sitting and thinking, which of course is, the opposite of action. So this was just another shot of her film of Cy Twombly. This is his bookshelves. It's always interesting to see the ephemera and books that people surround themselves with, or nothing. Some studios are completely clinically empty. It's interesting to see what kind of context people need. So we've discussed this quite a few times. I'm very suspicious of the word inspiring. I find it very difficult, probably because it's been so massively overused. So I wanted to sort of reframe it, because obviously it is about inspiration, but actually it's maybe better to articulate it. I find her work is important to me because it somehow gave me the permission to do the things that I needed to do, and then to make me want to do them. I find that when you look at certain people's work, it makes you want to make things. So this, again, is not her work. This is Twombly, but I'm showing this here because actually, when I started researching this, I realized that she gave a talk at the Dia Foundation, which was the inspiration for this original series. So the Dia Foundation have a long-running series where artists talk about artists who are within the collection. And so this format is what inspired us. And she gave one of these talks, and she talked about Twombly, who is also, I think Tacit ad-Din is quite hard to talk about, but I think Twombly is very hard to talk about. Slides? Oh yeah, thanks. Suddenly met with an image of my own face. Yay. So I listened to her talk yesterday, but I could only hear the audio, which was quite funny because she was obviously showing loads of pictures, and I just had to imagine the pictures, which I actually quite enjoyed as a process. And she also seemed to be quite nervous talking about him, which I understand because, we're talking about something you love is challenging in unique ways. She talks about her frustration in trying to get images of certain things. She uses the word inspired, but she also talks about her magnificent awe, which I think is better at his work. She talks about how Twombly's aesthetic seduction is so hard to put into words. And she mentioned something which has occurred to me entirely separately in my own practice, that there is something very aesthetically moving about the handwritten word, that it has a searching tone to its unevenness. And this extends into the fact that you can draw by writing and write by drawing. And this is something I do a lot in my own practice. I write and draw together, and then the two seem to deform each other in ways that I'm not expecting. Right. So the work that I'm going to talk about is something that is deep in my memory. She has a massive body of work at this point, and I'm really only going to touch mainly on this exhibition and a few more of the later drawings. So the exhibition I'm talking about is in 1998. In 1998, I was living in London, or I had just gone to school in London, and I was a teenager. So I looked up images of London in the 90s, and actually, when you look up London in the 90s, the Google search throws up this, which is also an exhibition I saw the year before the one I wanted to talk about. This was the Sensation exhibition at the Royal Academy, and it was an absolute blockbuster. And it launched the careers of the young British artists. It was a sort of famous and controversial. What did I write? And it had a huge influence on my peers and I. And I think what I have really come to appreciate about Dean's work is that it was always a very dignified remove from this new blend of art and fashion and advertising. And she somehow always had huge conviction in her vision. There was something singular about her work. It didn't feel condemned to newness as much contemporary art now did. And it looked both backwards and forwards. I feel like in her work, she's not afraid of history or making works that are historically conscious. And obviously, I feel we can look back now and see that her work has endured a lot better than many of the artists in the Sensation exhibition. So the exhibition I saw was at the Tate Gallery, and it was the Turner Prize. I actually thought she'd won it, and then I looked it up, and it was Chris Ofili who won it that year. It wasn't her. So I think a lot of my talk is about misremembering. It's about how I internalized this exhibition. So I don't remember any of the other works in the exhibition, but I do remember this one. It was very beautiful, but also because there was a huge uproar in the British tabloid press about the fact that the canvas is sitting on elephant dung. And these are the things that sometimes stick with you, even if you wish they didn't. It's immensely hard to find documentation online of this exhibition. I took this one because it really reminds me of shitty arts programming you would see on television in the 90s, and that they would film everything from really awkward, sort of stupid angles, as though the camera was at some terrible rave. And so these pictures are absolutely not suited to this angle, but this somehow absolutely portrays the era in which these works were present. So this is the Tate Gallery, filmed as though it's the lobby of a bad fashion shop. So I should talk about the work. So this work she'd done, it's called 7 boards in 7 days, and she'd done, these are huge, they're 240 by 240, and it's on blackboard, not slate, but it's on blackboard, and it just uses plain chalk. And it's images of the sea at night in lots of different, so in terms of misremembering, this is a diversion for me because this is part of how I remembered the work, even though it's entirely false. So I'm also British like her, and there's something to be said about it is an island, and it has an island mentality. It's entirely surrounded by the sea, and I can't really emphasize how that really soaks into the imagination there. So it's called the Roaring Forties, which I thought was to do with the shipping forecast. So the shipping forecast is something they play late at night on the BBC, and if you're not asleep and you can't sleep, you quite often listen to the shipping forecast, which is this sort of poetic incantation of the weather at different points around the island. And so they do this, and they recite these names, and one of them is the 40s. And so I was like, God, she must be talking about the shipping forecast. The shipping forecast is very beloved in the UK. You can listen to it. It's still played all the time. It has an actual function for people who are at sea, but it also has a sort of sentimental function for those of us who just grew up. It was a sort of strange, poetic moment in each day, is the shipping forecast. So, of course, it's got nothing to do with the shipping forecast. It's actually, the Roaring Forties is the part of the Antarctic, where that's very, very stormy. And so this is if you Google Roaring Forties, you get this historical image of a ship at sea. But so her work is really about this era of Antarctic exploration. So there's 7 boards. I couldn't find pictures of all 7 of them. I have 4, or I have 3, or I have 2. I don't know what was happening with exhibition documentation at that time, but they didn't want me to have it, so I didn't find it. All right. I think there's something to be said. So it was in the Tate. At this point, the Tate Modern didn't exist. This is 1998. There was only the Tate Britain. And I was a teenager, and I used to go there a lot. In my memory, the room with her work in it was very dimly lit, because the drawings were kind of interestingly hard to see. But I'm not sure that that is real. I think maybe I've remembered that. What's also in the Tate Britain is the Rothko room, and that definitely is dimly lit. And I used to go and sit in there too. So I wonder whether the two have become conflated in my memory of these things. And actually, I think that I realized they make quite a nice comparison between the two of them. I found the Rothko room used to really fill me with this strange awe. And it was the first work where I was really aware of the power and sort of radicality of this kind of abstraction. But I felt that she combined that with figuration. So she took this power further. And so for me, this was then also the beginnings of a possibility of a place between figuration and abstraction. So her works are very figuratively virtuosic. They often are described as monumental because of their scale. And they also have this fragility, because as I said, she's using the most simple form of chalk. And then something which I will try and articulate, they have this mysterious quality. I guess they're very ghost-like. I'm going to try and articulate that better. And as I said, that these pictures particularly have this feeling of the sea at night, which is a particularly sort of image, I think, sublime sense of something that's utterly overwhelming and therefore terrifying. And then here it's sort of human people battling the sea at night. I've done quite a bit of research in my own work on female mystics. I'm really interested in this particular quality of Delphic otherness of the female visionary. And I think I see Dean very much in this line of female mystics. There's also another aside, a word I came across many years later, but I think also fits with these words, these works about the sea on Blackboard, which is this word calenture, which is, it was a particular type of fever that sailors would get after they'd been at sea for many, many months, where they would have a sort of spatial disassociation, and they would suddenly think that the waves were rolling hills. And they would get off the ship to walk around, and they would drown. And so this evokes this for me, but again, this is a personal thing for me. This is a chalk mine. So I think one of the things I really appreciate about Dean's work is that she has such a awareness of the metaphorical import of the materials that she's using. So she's talked a lot about film and what film is, but she also, using chalk, really makes you think about what chalk is. Firstly, chalk is this hugely democratic material, because really it's the cheapest chalk that's the best chalk to draw with. You don't have to have fancy chalk. It's really the stuff that comes in those kind of cigarette box packaging. It's always been that way. Blackboard chalk, just school blackboard chalk, is the best form of material. And then in the same way that I guess oil is a remnant of ancient sunlight, chalk is a remnant of ancient seas. Formed during the Cretaceous period, chalk deposits, of which there are many on the coastline of Britain, are made of the shells of ancient marine life. So in that sense, it is really of the landscape. In a way that is really nice. I think we think about clay and things like that a lot, but chalk, I feel, sometimes gets overlooked for its romantic origins. And it's a sort of object that's made of deep time. She doesn't always draw on slate, but she has drawn on slate, which is obviously the traditional blackboard material. And slate, I also know from my own research, is nice in terms of its structure, because it's made of compressed layers, like the pages of a closed book. So if you cut through slate, you can see the sort of gradations of all the different layers. I know that she doesn't draw on slate for the 240 by 240, because I know that you don't get slate in that format, because I've tried. It's too brittle. When they mine it, you can only get it about 1.5 meters across. So the other thing that I've observed about drawing in chalk from my own experience, especially on slate, is that you're really just moving dust around. And the image holds in this fragile configuration of dust that can be removed again with the slightest friction. Unlike Dean, I draw and then completely erase the drawings and then draw something completely different. So the beginning of a new work is often the process of completely destroying the old one. But I have a phrase that I sometimes write on the works themselves, which is, we are all just gravity, dust, and gas, which I think is some flippant remark that a physicist made in a sort of popular science context. But somehow it stayed with me and I use it a lot. And I think the nice thing about writing in chalk on a vertical surface is that the chalk dust seems to really, in that moment, be defying gravity. The other thing I know about drawing in chalk is that you actually can't fix it. I've tried. You spray it, it dissolves. And so they're permanently impermanent. And so if you're trying to store them, it's a sort of interesting process. But they have this enduring fragility to them because the dust is just there, but for the grace of God. All right, I'm going to go a bit faster. One of the things she brings up when she talks about Cy Twombly and his relationship with text is the manuscripts of James Joyce, especially the ones that the British Library have of Finnegan's Wake. And she talks about the fact that Joyce was basically blind. And so when he was editing, he would quite often write over the top. And he had this very, very lively editing system of different colors where he would write and then score through things. And they are sort of almost indecipherable, these manuscripts. There were only a few people who really understood how to turn them into clean text. I find that these, even though these aren't intended as artworks, I can totally see why they are inspiring to artists because they're vestiges of an action. This is a way of, you're really watching thought happen. And it shows the urgency of needing to get the thought down on paper. She has referred to her blackboards as dysfunctional storyboards, so from a sort of film background, invoking and denying narrative intention, like unearthed fragments of poetry. I was thinking of Sappho, that where our imaginations float in the space in between. Her work is often described as poetic, which is usually very lazy critical parlance for something that people can't really be bothered to articulate in a proper way. I have analogy to certain words. But obviously, I think poetry is at play here, but I think the adjective poetic is not helpful. This is a book by a poet and philosopher called Jan Zwicky, and I have it in my studio and I return to it all the time. And it's about the mechanisms of poetry and how they relate to the way artworks function. It's called Wisdom and Metaphor, and she writes about how understanding metaphor, especially in poetry, is key to understanding how we shape our understanding of the world. Let's stay there. So the quote is, metaphor is one way of showing how patterns of meaning in the world intersect and echo one another. The ability to think analogically is a reflection of sensitivity to ontological form. I think for me, Tacita Dean's works are somehow images of exactly those kind of echoes. They remind us that we know more than we can tell. And I'm unable to tell you what they mean, but I can tell you what they mean to me, which seems a better formulation. I wrote this talk late last night, and this was just something I wanted to include, and so I put this is another quote from Wisdom and Metaphor by Louise Gluck, and it says, art is not a service. I have to read it from here. Art is not a service, or rather it does not reliably serve all people in a standardized way. Its service is to the spirit from which it removes the misery of inertia. I just thought that also seemed nice for this context. Chance. Dean speaks a lot about the serendipity of the found image. Found images are now they can become quite a cliche, especially with the proliferation of the internet, where so many images can be found. The found image from my generation was exciting and transgressive because it was about taking an old piece of printed matter and repurposing it in your own context, and also using it for its innate strangeness. We were all about, certainly in the 90s, we were about graffiti and the romance of vandalism. All my first artworks were handmade zines, and I transgressed out of studying literature to wanting to destroy or repurpose it. The found image is a strategy for bringing strangeness in. There are many uninvited guests haunting a found image. And if you use it right, you can bring them out. I have stacks and stacks of old images where I can always find what I did not yet know I needed. And I think working with found images, to return to this idea of mysticism, can feel like a form of divination. I have a book on my shelf called Constraining Chance, which is essentially about the work of the writer Georges Perec. And it examines how Perec stages his games of chance in order to illuminate fiction's tendency to project final causes onto unintended outcomes. There is a quote from this book that I copied out because it felt very true, that the construct we call chance, because it's a construct within our own imaginations, shows our inability either to wholly believe in a meaningful universe or to wholly reject the quest for meaning. So we use our narrative imaginations to give meaning to the world. Dean also talks about the found surface. So this is, and often the descriptions of what her work is made of are quite cryptic and interesting, but this is enamel on found, tarnished steam train window. So she has a series where the works, she took the windows out of an old train and ran a series of images across them. I'm going to skip through this because this is running on. This was her film of the sound mirrors, and I have this in there because these are real things and you can go and see them, and I would, it's an amazing kind of very English pilgrimage to make. This is early radar technology that's along the coastline of the east coast of England, and these huge concrete structures where they would be able to listen to ships during the Second World War, but they were almost instantly redundant. So they're these amazing science fiction relics of a future that never came to pass. And she made a very beautiful film about them. Oh, there. So this is the last slide. Even when I'm not drawing, I call my works drawings, and I think her work was my first encounter with what an expanded notion of drawing might be. Drawing not as a sketch or a rehearsal, but drawing as a way of transcribing thought, an alchemical moment of thought into act and act into thing, pulling something out of the void. Drawings have a unique presence. Extraordinary drawings are a transcendent display of force. I think what I most appreciate is the quality of contemplation that Tacita Dean's works evoke. I think also about contemplation generally in our attention deficit age. I think about the potential for re-enchanting the world. I think about mysticism and a desire to return art to its sacred origins. I wonder whether we have come through deconstruction of meaning and all its games and out the other side. I think growing up in the 90s, which was a very strange time of cynicism and political and historical apathy and complacency, I got the full brunt of postmodernism. It was very exciting until I realized that it wasn't actually giving me what I needed. And so I find that her work with its sort of more ancient feel has a more ancient feel for me. So I could reject that. This is an art that affirms our deepest metaphysical inclinations. And it's an art that's not afraid to be earnest. It's not a question of what does it mean, but what does it make you want to believe. There is a quote from the French poet Paul Valéry that I return to all the time, and I think it works well here. What is there more mysterious than clarity? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, you can hear me. Thank you so much. This was so cool. I had no idea, so we didn't rehearse together. Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're perfect on time. Thanks for coming. I will be talking on Hell and Mira, which is equally hard. I love that we set ourselves a challenging bar here for like kind of going into this series. Anyhow, just maybe like to go back, like a really lovely part about organizing and also witnessing these talks has been to kind of witness all these different ways in which it's possible to kind of talk about still living, colleagues, I guess. And they're kind of an exercise in language, right? And like kind of how language fails. But they also invite for a deeper engagement and sharing and a temporary kind of gathering like right now. So these are kind of the underlining, this is kind of the underlining spirit of the talks that like, or kind of the program that we've been doing, right? And like kind of what we're interested in. So, and I feel like it's also something that always, and your talk now did that as well, kind of sparks, yeah? Like I don't even know where to exactly or what to exactly, but it kind of is a thing much needed, I think, in this time characterized by all these divisions and ruptures. So, to my talk, deciding is not easy. I could have talked about numerous artists I love, I admire, I feel inspired by. We battle about this word back and forth. I'm more okay with it. Or that also artists that I'm in imaginary or real companionship with, that nourish but also empower my own thinking, or my own practice, or that just simply encourage. So it's also, there's numerous artists who I feel like I'm growing with or I'm moving alongside with, from a distance or up close, that I'm kind of proud for or of or glad for or thankful for doing it all, navigating all of this in their own ways, for speaking up, for being in this world, for navigating the market or the difficult politics of visibility and visuality and all of that. And so for this talk, though, I decided to talk about a dear friend of mine who, before becoming a friend, whose works I very much already admired from a distance. So it's Helen Handel Mira. And Helen's biography states that Helen Mira was born in 1970 in Rochester, New York. And she lives and works in West Marin in California, which is where we met back in 2019 when I still lived in San Francisco. And it was a solidarity gathering at the David Ireland House that was undergoing structural changes, and we kind of gathered in solidarity of support for trying to preserve this space that we found very relevant for the region. And that's when I realized who this person was that was kind of standing over there in my proximity, as I had kind of looked her work up for many years. And then a dear friend of mine convinced me in this like cute American naive way to go over and tell her that I love her. and so I kind of did in a cooler way. But I asked Helen if Helen was Helen. And known for her terseness and coarseness, she replied, yes. And who are you and where are you? Which very much describes an interaction with Helen. So very conscious of this kind of slight shift of attention, I answered that I was here, but where I come from was complicated, and that I wasn't sure how long I wanted to keep staying there. And then she looked at me and she replied, well, I think if you feel more like yourself somewhere else, you should probably be in that place. So that moment kind of marked a twofold beginning. One, the beginning of my return back to Europe, and two, kind of the beginning of of a sparse and soulful friendship with one of my dearest artists. So I decided to talk about her work today as an invitation to try to figure out what exactly is that I find so touching or close or that stretches me out about Handel's work. As I said, I will not focus on any accurate description or any kind of art historic consistency or precision. So, yeah, forgive me and the many people that know her work very well. But ideally, my thoughts can expand and stretch on some of the angles from which to approach her artistic practice as simple, complex, and also at times very enigmatic in her form. So I encountered her work as well as a student, and it struck me for its registers of an alignment with arte povera, which you can already kind of guess if you don't know her work here, for the use of materials such as wool or fabric or thread or found planks, wood, etc. It's not that I particularly align with the movement in my own practice, but I always really loved it nonetheless for its kind of decentralized beginning, right? Like Italy in the 70s, like it wasn't like happening in like at that moment, I would say like more of a kind of Western moment, but it kind of thrust toward materiality in a way that really dethroned the prestigious kind of marble, canvas, bronze. So that's always what I loved about this movement, and what I really also, I think what also really pulled me into her work. So it is Helen's work too that first struck me through the seeming smallness of the gesture in her work. A blend of found material and like this very minimalist alignment, like very formal language, formal precision, through embedding what I think of as simple choreographies, for example, walking, which I will talk about later, or holding, or weaving, or passing by, or passing through, that find their ways kind of silently and quietly, but very stubbornly, into the materialization or becoming of her work. There's a stubbornness in her work that I also really love in the consequence in how she does it. I couldn't talk about or think about her work without mentioning her Buddhist practice. So this is a quote from an interview she had recently about a show at Cap Street at the Wattis Institute in San Francisco. Not knowing is the most intimate. Yeah. I think coming out of a Buddhist practice, which she's had for many decades, she really cares about this kind of observation of the mind, which consequences an observation of language and its construction and its formfulness, but also its formlessness. She's really interested, and she kind of makes us destabilize these certain categories, such as language, which I really love. So formlessness that is aimed at in like Zen. So not knowing is the most intimate, which I feel like we are invited in when looking at these like works of hers, which of course is the work of many conceptual driven artists also, right? Like, and also of the Cittadini, you were just talking about that too, like this kind of, what do we do when we're confronted with not knowing, and how does the work unfold? So I just wanted to put in a slide of like kind of how the works looked exhibited once, and also that you have an idea of the scale. So this is at Peter Freeman in a show that was called Bones or Spaces in 2018. So all of these works are hand-woven, which is very relevant by her, and they're very modest in size. The dimensions are like that, approximately. They hold a very restricted palette, also as of going back to kind of arte povera, but also as she uses natural dye a lot. And they're oriented around her practice of walking, which she started in 2018. No, 8. Sorry. She started in 2008. And that's hearsay, not actual fact. Or I remember her telling me this, that it started at a residency actually in Basel in 2008 when she was on a residency and provided with her studio space, which was a desk and a chair. And so panicking at that sight a bit, how does one do art with this setup, right? Depending on what kind of art you do. And as of her practice, of course, she started going for walks, because when in Switzerland, you go for a hike. Yuko Lipid describes her engagement as Mira's practice champions walking as a specific form of thinking that bypasses language, a sort of meditation in motion. So I think that's relevant when thinking about these weaves and the walks prior to the weaves, and how the walks in time through real space kind of walk their way through the loom and find the beginning and the end of the talk. So what we see is time in the present tense, the concrete realization of present time, translated into the piece, which I find a very sensual relation to material that I find very beautiful and very touching. And so it's also the yarn kind of transforms the movement of the artist's body and her working with the hands, the repeated movement, right, the repetition of her arms, and then this kind of attention. So Mira's work is mainly rooted right in the consequence of like a very high conceptualist approach with a, maybe let's call it low, like high conceptualism and maybe low imposition of the work, as kind of imposing in a low way or in a low key into space, right, through its size, or imposing in a very low way the content on its form, while never negating one or the other, right? Like the concept or the content, as well as the kind of work, they're never negated, despite their unaggressiveness, I guess. Or even the artist as a figure upon kind of the art world. Like most people kind of know but don't know, right? Like she even as an artist, she almost evaporates from self-representation, which I find a very interesting strategy. And this is a quote: "It is conceptual and often about choreographing attention or experience. It seems that her practice is about a mentality," which I really love. So the more time spent with it, the more the mentality transmits or transposes. So the weavings generally, from how I understand them, happen after a daily routine of, so Marin is a very beautiful place in north of San Francisco, for those who don't know. Right by the coast, and so it's very wild and has these rugged cliffs and rolling hills and whales, and I don't know. It's like it's a very strong landscape, and so she goes on daily walk to a meditation center, meditates, observes, hikes, jumps into the water, then hikes, and then produces these works. So it's like this very daily kind of implication of a routine, and then also in the Buddhist tradition, I guess, lets the work go, finishes it, and kind of lets it go. I really love the use of materials. I'm in love with the economicality of each gesture, but also the placed precision of each decision that she makes. I also find that her works really allow like breath or life to kind of sweep through willing imperfections in the work. And they really open up between this thing we think about a lot, right, which is the binaries, and opening up the binaries, and in this case really between being and making, right, like kind of, yeah. It's hard to try to, right? It's hard to put kind of words to it, but kind of these, yeah, breaking this kind of divide between being and making. Also through their very ordinariness, the often unseen or unnoticed or maybe like marginal aesthetic field of, for example, weaving, is very present and makes presence and makes itself present, and kind of also always invites the world, the outside, into the work, which or like kind of has this like breath of life in the works, which I really admire. So this is the first work I actually encountered of hers. And I was a bachelor student at that time. I had just moved back from Berlin. I was, you know, charged with a critical Berlinish attitude. And what I saw in this work was definitely different than what was intended. But I saw these identically shaped pieces of dark cloth that reminded me of kind of black flags, right? I saw kind of a gesture of resistance, a fragment of maybe leaning or tired black flags draped over a piece of wood. And then I engaged with it like further and learned that the dark cloth draped over cedar wood supports, so that's kind of like what's stated. Each strip combines the wool of 2 different black sheep, which are identified in the work's titles by location. I read them as kind of a flag, a bunting, maybe even a decor for like a kid's birthday, but with a somber tone, like a Berlinish kid's birthday, maybe. But also a simple shape, like in the tradition of minimalism, right? Attached with the simplicity of a nail, right? With the very nothing too complicated, always in her work, right? And so reading Wool from Black Sheep, I was taken into her precision, or like I started developing this eye of precision that dangles between her work and the word. So what you learn from looking at this piece is that black sheep aren't black sheep are brown. The wool is brown. And as a total, the installation composes as a gradual accumulation of slight differences. So we have these different brown tones we think are black, right? And it invites to endure and hold with seeming similarities, opens up to entire differences simultaneously, as it is different sheep. And so also as through this political gaze that I certainly have and also had back then, I kind of fell in love with this relation between simple form and simple gesture, abstract work, and subtle yet really stark political implication. At least that's how I read it. So I also read it in a time when, for those who can't remember or don't know, SVP was having its infamously racist posters up everywhere in Switzerland, where white sheep are kicking out a black one standing on top of the national flag, right? So of course always the context in which one views the work, which isn't necessarily the intention of the artist. But the work invites me to perceive from a distance and also like really move up close and kind of teaches me in a mentality of closer observation to question the category of like the black sheep and having destabilized the consistency of their color. So the sharp relation between material and gestural precision, the conceptual performativity of the work, for a lack of a better term, I guess, but also what I love about it is the implied and invisible body that's there, of the author, but also of the sheep, and then of the blank, right? Whatever else we can, whatever subjectivity else we, of course, can then add to it. So this is what really drew me to her practice, a strictly formal work that opens like sneakily to socio-political historic critique or implication, instead of through representing or documenting the real or the topic or the world. It kind of comes from movement, it comes from material. And so this is a detour, an anecdotal note, like an anecdotal detour, because this is a photograph that Helen Handel just sent me a few days ago. The first time I visited Helen after we met, she opened the door and I sighted this drawing right behind her, this one. And I had this like racing heartbeat, and I didn't know who to actually look at because I was really excited about the drawing. I kind of had this crushy feeling about this drawing, and I couldn't quite place it why. I mean, it's really hard to tell why you love something when you see it. But up until a week ago, when I wrote her, I thought it was Helen's work, which it isn't. So I fell in love with the projection of her work. What it actually is Julia Fisch's work, and Handel wrote to me. This was my advisor in graduate school in Chicago at the University in Illinois. She had a show at the Renaissance Society in 1996, and this was a study for one of the paintings, and it brought me to tears. So also she had had this feeling of, yeah, we somehow had shared, I guess, this a similar feeling for this work, and so Julia gave it to Helen then afterwards. And so it's a mistake of authorship I gladly kind of wanted to take into this talk and to present, since it's really like these moments that kind of we see these loops of inspiration or consistencies and like how they evolve and how we learn about artists and artists, and artists, right? So this is the 1.5 last work I want to talk about, which is called A Harmless Mistake, and it's within the exhibition that's still on, up and running right now at the Swiss Institute in New York, and it's a show called Spora. It's a group show, and the work that Helen did there is called Harmless Mistake, kind of back to this gesture of non-aggression, I guess. And it's a conceptual work that has a form of instruction to it. So the color patches or stripes, they are found through the entire building or through the show, and they're the result of this conceptual instruction, which says that all repainting or touching up of the white walls before the exhibition must be now done instead of with fresh new white paint, with remaindered mixed paint that's like around, that like every exhibition space has rotting away in their back room. So instead of letting it rot away, to actually like mark all the fillings and remakings and redos of like touch-ups that are done before a show is installed. So these gestures of maintenance work by museum workers are made visible also, of course, which I really love, as well as the kind of ongoing overuse of paint, which is another of her concern as a kind of an ecological vein. So this work to me again kind of brings into question how much new white walls need to be reasserted in an exhibition space over and over again, or maybe poetically and metaphorically, but also very materially, and actively actually suggest that they might not need to, or that we might be able to live with the muddle instead and endure some of the shades. So this is the half that I meant, that I wanted to add, which is a document that Helen created, which is called cathartes. And cathartes is a Greek word for turkey vultures, a very common bird in Northern America. And it's also a Greek word for purifier, as these birds obtain most of their diet by scavenging, so by decomposing corpses in nature. The vulture is a bird that does not kill. And I think that's a very beautiful conceptualization of what then she does in this document. So instead of, for example, what I love about this document, which is of course a work, but also a contract, I will talk about this more in a second, instead of doing a work on the climate crisis, or instead of creating new representations of its most suffering subjects, or developing kind of speech, I guess, engaging in it, this is really a kind of very clear, simple, and especially attainable and possibly, and especially possible set of guidelines for how to cause less harm. And in this case, how to cause less ecological harm in the art ecosystem. So I just want to highlight a few things. So the document is circling around, this is what the upper part of the text says, this is a quote, and I think also a very beautiful example of how Helen writes talks. how we live among other sentient beings whose lives we do not think are less worthy of attention than our own, and how we actually go about things. So a document of how we go about things and how we could go about things in a different way. So my absolute favorite sentence, and also the talks on artists, right, have been this question for like, what are talks that somehow stay behind your retinal space and you cannot forget about? And it's also this has stayed with me ever since I encountered it, is kind of the following on line 3, which says, we recognize that our individual actions are almost immeasurably small, but we love the small, so it makes no sense to dismiss the small, and we know that all small is relative. So yeah, I think this really echoes in my mind and highlights the consequentialness of the work. So there's also a writer that can then be downloaded as kind of a contract between artists and institutions. For example, that for the duration of the exhibition, that, for example, deal with something like how to not fly about or how to travel by train if possible. I give very clear kind of hands-on, ideas of, well, what can we do about it? It's too big, right? So like starting with a small kind of offering. Also, what I love, and I want to spread more, is the idea of avoiding flights and how institutions can insensitivize not flying by offering equivalent cash to artists in lieu of covering flight and lodging costs. I love that one. Okay, so ending the talk with a few more slides. Helen's work is subtle. It uses minor gestures, slight shifts, yet I never find her work to be misunderstood as only soft, only gentle, only appeasing. What I find nested in this practice is an altering sense of a training awareness or of a training of looking or perception. And within that, I find these concise moments of what I call quiet solidarities a lot in my own work that can be found everywhere. And so I find Handel's work kind of a sharpness of interweaving quite complex, never categorical, and therefore I'd say queer strategies of artistic creation imbued with, and by queer I mean like imbued with these elegant refusals toward how the normative writes itself into the daily, into the quotidian, and how slight shifts can alter the perception and also insert critique, I guess. The practice is inviting, is invested, is including, is side to side, is generously horizontal work, where the artist isn't the loser or the winner, nor is it the gallery, but a breath of fresh air mixed up with the stale breath of history, in an ever-disappearing loop between the two. So here I also, what I love about this work particularly is also that other works are mounted on it or next to it or beside it. So not to also always have this separation of works, right? But here it's next to Lee Mary Manning's work and here next to Dion Lee's photographs or below the photographs. So politics is in the details, is in abstraction, is in an examination through formal precision. It is not easily immediate, open, kind of critical awareness. It's in the training of attention to details. It's also, I find it like kind of hiddenly fiery and smirk and humorous and awkward and weird. And I find it also erotic, and I also find it energetic, and I find it lively. And I will end with this slide and a quote by another artist whom I admire. So this is also a photograph in the same, with the same photograph by Julia Fish that Helen sent me. It's a, I guess, very now to be made or currently happening work, which reads as doubtless guest and then doubtless written backwards and guest written backwards. So we're skewed into the question and the terminology of what a doubtless and what a guest is and what to not doubt is and what to be a guest is. So being these doubtless guests, I guess, passing through, I found in an article, I will end with beauty because it's the tema non grata, the thing we never talk about, yet it's the centerpiece of art. So I'm daring here because I certainly found all the works beautiful I was just talking about. I read Helen's definitions of beauty in an article. She says it's when something exists just as it is without interference. And I think that's commonly not our understanding of beauty, right? As it is societally we seem drifting off between like shape-shifting lifts, compulsive alterations, tension, like scroll, I don't know, like, right? We modify and we alternate and we really, it seems that interfering is one of the most developed symptoms of our times. So I like this call for not interfering. And I will end the talk with Etel Adnan, who is a dead artist, but so I'm breaking our own rules, of course. But an artist that's very important, Lebanese, U.S.-American lesbian artist who also lived in California, which I guess brings all the three of us together in this talk. Also with an equally kind of sharp political sensibility and so on. So Adnan said in her last interview in 2021 before her death, something that I remember occasionally and I kind of want to share with you before this end of the talk. She said, "We don't speak of beauty anymore in art criticism," with this beautiful French accent also, which I won't, enact. "We don't mention it anymore. It's démodé, it's out of fashion. But it isn't really beauty. It's an inner sense, and it makes us happy. It's not complicated, and we really, really need it." Yeah, thank you for coming.